So, good morning or afternoon. Again, this is Dr. Lisa Boss, and I'm back to talk to you about your second assignment in Module 2, which is assignment 2B, and that is the background and significance section. So, I found a couple of more good examples for you. Let's see. Okay, this first systematic review was also in the Canvas in the above sections where there were examples. And so this one is the effectiveness of policy interventions for school bullying. So this one, in my opinion, is a good example. I don't like it when it looks like that. This one is a good example of a nice background and significance. So one thing to notice is that this journal format is different than the other ones where they don't have a subheading here. And so once you start reading it, it's obvious that they don't even really have an introduction. So remember, we said the introduction is just short and concise and exciting to grab the reader in and for you to start to build your case on why this is an issue. They don't have that. They just start with the background and significance, which is just fine. So you'll notice that journals do things differently, just like faculty do things differently. And none of them are right or wrong. It's just how they choose to do it. And so that's how this journal has chosen to do this. So they start with talking about bullying in schools. And so really just this is a kind of a common term now that people have been throwing around pretty seriously for at least 10 years. And so people seem to know or maybe even have their own perceptions of what it is, but I think it's a good idea. Like what they did here was to give a definition of what bullying is. That really sets the stage for their perspective. Then they also talk about how it's a widespread phenomenon. There were a study that had 82 studies that had 22 countries all over the world. Half of youth are involved in bullying. So that's a big deal. That certainly gets my attention. Then they go on to talk about the negative outcome. So not only is it widespread and it affects so many people, they have 3 paragraphs here where they're talking about the negative outcome. So there's the physical piece, mental, behavioral problems. They disengage. They have higher rates of absenteeism. They have psychosocial difficulties. They even talk about how it's not only the bully and the victim, but the bystanders are also affected. So they're really going into detail about why bullying is important and why we need to look at it. So then the next thing they start talking about is policy as an intervention. So I think this was a good tactic for them to start with the bullying, because that's more of a variable that people might think is exciting and, oh my gosh, we really need to address this. Most likely, since half of the kids in the world have been bullied in some way, then most likely they can even relate to it. They might know somebody who's been bullied, or they might even have had their own child be bullied. So it definitely reels them in. Versus if they had started out talking about policy, I don't know that would have been as exciting and really would have gotten people's attention. So this was a good strategy for them. And so that's also something that you need to think about when you look at your variables and how you're going to talk about them, because the order of them is definitely critical. So you need to figure out which one is the best one to start with. Which one can I add a statistic, or can we really stress is the main problem? And so that's what they did here. Bullying, they started out with, and then they went down and started talking about policy. And so for most people, they're not even going to really know, how can policy even be used as an intervention for bullying? So they have to take a pretty good amount of time here and explain that. So they even start talking about historically in 1995 or 1999, following the Columbine high school shootings, that's really when policies addressing bullying emerged. So, they're really thinking that people, I didn't know that most people don't even really know the history of it. And so they provide this brief history of this is where it started. Um, and then really, what is a policy? Then they go in to talk about how it's an advantage to use policy interventions for bullying and how they can influence practices. Then they give you an example. They have another advantage of bullying policies is that they are upstream interventions that provide a foundation for downstream interventions. And then they go on to really explain what that means. They talk about policy design. They go on to talk about anti-bullying laws. Their last paragraph here, despite the widespread adoption of anti-bullying policies within the United States, really few studies have examined the effectiveness of this intervention. So when the research and when the evidence is scant on a certain topic that is such a big deal as bullying and affects so many people, they really set themselves up to build the case that what they're talking about here is important and needs to be talked about. And then they go on to talk about the purpose. But I think this is a really good example where they spent an appropriate amount of time talking about the variables. So the bullying, this is what it is. It affects half of the youth in the world. And these are the negative outcomes. But then when you get down to policy, something that people just aren't sure of, and how do you link the two together, they spent a lot of paragraphs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 paragraphs. And so I think that was really necessary because you have to, in this background and significance section, really set the stage for why. Why are you tying these two together, these two variables? Why is it important? Why do we care? So that's really the overall goal, and I think they did a good job here. And then one more example is a loneliness and cognitive function review that I published in 2015. And so here's another example of how journals are different. So here it actually says introduction. And so those first 2 paragraphs I would say are introduction. So I try to talk about loneliness and try to tie that superficially at first with cognitive decline and really why that's important and why we care. And then starting here where it says currently the potential mechanism, so that's the 3rd paragraph, that's really where the background and significance start, even though it doesn't have a subheading. But in the introduction, I really connected the two. So loneliness is connected with cognitive decline. So then I really need to talk about how. And so the way that we think they're connected is the same way that we think stress and cognitive decline are connected. So we have potential biological mechanisms underlying the association of loneliness and cognitive function. So we do have evidence that suggests the APA axis over time with chronic stress can damage the brain in the areas of learning and memory and executive function. And so I just start there by saying there is some evidence that says loneliness might be in the same boat as stress and be a chronic stressor that can activate the HPA axis. And so that's one way that we think they're connected. And then I go on to give some examples of loneliness and cortisol in college students and in older adults, in middle adults. What else? And a little bit more about the pathos. So I'm really kind of setting the stage for, this is what the preliminary evidence shows. This is what we think. This is what some other evidence has shown in other populations, although they're not in our population. So that's another way that I'm kind of setting myself up, that we don't even have, it's been shown in teenagers, but what about older adults? Then I go on to talk even more about the biological piece, that it could have something also to do with the prolonged hypercortisolism disrupts the AC hormonal balance. And so that also leaves the detrimental effects of cortisol unopposed and results in negative changes in the brain. And then lastly, inflammation. Here we have another biological mechanism through which stress and loneliness may impact cognitive function. And so again, how are loneliness and inflammation? What's the tie there? Well, they're highly reactive to stress, lonely people. And prolonged and greater activation of the glucocorticoids may dysregulate the inflammatory response. So I go and explain those processes and then give some more examples and the evidence that support that thought. But, part of supporting that thought and providing a few examples of evidence is that we don't have enough. So we have these few articles that are in teenagers, or they're in this, or they're in that, but really overall it's not enough evidence to make a decision or to be able to say for certain how any of these are tied together. So that's the reason why I want to do a systematic review, so that I can do a comprehensive and exhaustive search of the literature to really find out how many studies have looked at loneliness and cognitive function in the elderly, and then look at those findings and really deduct where we go from there. So similar to the other article, where they just kind of talked about bullying and really just gave the basic information about what it is, who it affects, what's bad about it, I kind of did the same thing for loneliness. So I think loneliness is something we think we probably know what it means, but I do give a definition and then start talking about how it's tied with cognitive function. And so because most people might not know that that's the thought, that loneliness is similar to stress and that can activate the HPA axis and all these biological pieces, that really needed to be explained and supported with evidence so that I can say, yeah, this is me building my case and it's not just made up, pulled out of the air somewhere. So I think that's it for this one. So we have had the two examples of background and significance. So again, it's a good idea if you want to develop an outline of just bullet points and take it to your faculty and say, this is what I think that I need to write. This is kind of how I think this should go down, and get their input. There's nothing wrong with that, and we encourage that. We love working with y'all on making these really good papers. So thank you and good luck.